I think this is a good moment to talk about Gödel's incompleteness theorems. So, can you explain them, and what did they teach us about the nature of mathematical truth?
Absolutely. It's one of the most profound developments in mathematical logic. I mean, the incompleteness theorems is when mathematical logic, in my view, first became sophisticated. It's a kind of birth of the subject of mathematical logic. But to understand the theorems, you really have to start a little bit earlier with Hilbert's program. Because at the time, with the Russell paradox and so on, there were these various contradictions popping up in various parts of set theory and the Burali-Forti paradox and so on. And Hilbert was famously supportive of set theory. I mean, there's this quote of him saying, "No one shall cast us from the paradise that Cantor has created for us." And what I take him to mean by that is he was so captured by the idea of using set theory as a foundation of mathematics, and it was so powerful and convenient and unifying in a way that was extremely important. And he didn't want to give that up. Despite the danger of these paradoxes, these contradictions, basically, is how some people viewed them. And so
This minefield of paradoxes.
right, a minefield. That's a really good way of describing the situation. And so Hilbert said, well, look, we have to fix this problem. We want to use the set theory foundations, but we want to do it in a way that is trustworthy and reliable. We can't allow that the foundations of mathematics are in question. This is a kind of attitude, I think, that underlies Hilbert and the Hilbert program. And so he proposed, look, we're going to have this strong theory, this set theory that we want to be proving our theorems in. But on the one hand, we want it to be as strong as possible. We would like it to answer all the questions. There's another famous quote of Hilbert in his retirement address where he proclaims, "Wir müssen wissen, wir werden wissen." So we must know, we will know, in which he's very optimistic about the ability of mathematics to answer all of the questions of mathematics that we have posed. We have all these problems we want to solve, and he is saying, we're going to do it. We're going to solve all these problems. So we want to propose this strong theory, and one has the sense that he had in mind set theory, in which all the questions are going to be answered. Okay. But secondly, we want to combine that with, in a very weak arithmetic, purely finitistic theory, we want to prove that the reasoning process of the strong theory is safe. Okay. So in order to make sense of that point of view, you basically have to invent the philosophy of formalism, where we can look at what is the proof, what is the nature of mathematical reasoning. And on Hilbert's way of thinking about this, a proof is basically itself a finitistic kind of object. It's a sequence of, if you think about the nature of what a proof is, it's a sequence of assertions which can be viewed as sort of sequences of symbols that conform with certain rules of logical reasoning. And this is a formalist way of understanding the nature of proof. So we think about a proof in a kind of syntactic, formal way, even though the contents of those statements might be referring to infinite, uncountable objects. The statements themselves are not infinite, uncountable objects. The statements themselves are just finite sequences of symbols.
So we kind of think of proof as, maybe it's fair to say, almost like outside of math. It's like tools operating on math. And then for Hilbert, he thought proof is inside the axiomatic system, something like this.
Yeah, that's helpful.
That's wild.
The main thing about formalism is that you think of the process of doing mathematics, you divorce it from the meaning of the mathematical assertions, right? So the meaning of the mathematical assertions that you make in this infinitary theory has to do with these huge uncountable infinities and so on, possibly, and that's a very sort of uncertain realm, maybe, and the source of the paradoxes and so on in some people's minds. And so, but the reasoning process itself consists of writing down sequences of symbols on your page, and undertaking an argument with them, which is following these finitary rules. And so So if we divorce the meaning of the symbols from just the process of manipulating the symbols, it's a way of looking at the nature of mathematics as a kind of formal game in which the meaning may be totally absent. I don't think it's necessarily part of the formalist view that there is no meaning behind, but rather it's emphasizing that we can divorce the meaning of the sentences from the process of manipulating those sentences. And then Hilbert wanted to prove in this purely finitary theory that if we follow the rules of that game, we're never going to get a contradiction. So those were the two aims of the Hilbert program, is to found the strong infinitary theory, probably set theory, which is going to answer all the questions. And then secondly, prove in the finitary theory that the strong theory is safe. In other words, consistent.
What does the word finitary and finitary theory mean?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, philosophically contentious, and people have different ideas about what exactly it should mean. And so there's hundreds of papers on exactly that question. But I like to take it just kind of informally. I mean, it means that we're talking about finite sequences of symbols, and we're going to have a theory, finite strings of symbols, and a finitary theory would be one whose subject matter is about those kinds of things, so that we can conceivably argue about the nature of these finite strings. So a proof is just a finite sequence of statements, so that every statement is either one of the axioms or follows by the laws of logic from the earlier statements in some specified manner, like using modus ponens or some other law of logic like that. And such that the last line on the list is, the theorem that you're proving. So that's what a proof is in this kind of way of thinking. To take a specific example, I mean, I always conceive of perhaps the most natural finitary theory that one would be called upon to exhibit would be Peano arithmetic, the theory of Peano arithmetic, which is a first-order theory of the nature of arithmetic. But okay, so some people say, well, Peano arithmetic has these strong first-order induction axioms, and there's much, much weaker versions of arithmetic, like I sigma naught or I sigma 1 and so on, which are even more finitary than Peano arithmetic. So different philosophical positions take different attitudes about what does it take to be finitary? How finitary do you have to be truly finitary?
So according to Perplexity, Peano arithmetic is a foundational system for formalizing the properties and operations of natural numbers using a set of axioms called the Peano axioms. Peano arithmetic provides a formal language and axioms for arithmetic operations such as addition and multiplication over the natural numbers. The axioms define the existence of a first natural number, usually 0 or 1, the concept of successor function, which generates the next natural number, rules for addition and multiplication built from these concepts, the principle of induction, allowing proofs around all natural numbers. And it goes on. So it's a very particular kind of arithmetic that is a finitary.
I view it as finitary, but this is a contentious view. I mean, not everyone agrees with that. That's what I was trying to hint at.
All right.
Peano arithmetic is one of the hugely successful theories of the natural numbers and elementary number theory. Essentially, all of classical number theory, so whatever kind of theorems you want to be proving about the prime numbers or factorization or any kind of finitary reasoning about finite combinatorial objects, all of it can be formalized in Peano arithmetic. I mean, that's the basic situation. Of course, one has to qualify those statements in light of the Gödel incompleteness theorem, but for the most part, the classical number theoretic analysis of the finite numbers is almost entirely developable inside Peano arithmetic. So if we go back to the Hilbert program, so Hilbert has these two goals: produce the strong theory which is going to answer all the questions, and then prove by purely finitary means that theory will never lead into contradiction. And one can think about, well, the incompleteness theorem should be viewed as a decisive refutation of the Hilbert program. It defeats both of those goals decisively, completely. But before explaining that, maybe one should think about, what if Hilbert had been right? What would be the nature of mathematics in the world that Hilbert is telling us to search for.
And if I may, going to Perplexity definition of Hilbert's program, it was David Hilbert's early 20th century project to give all of classical mathematics a completely secure finitary foundation. In essence, the goal was to formalize all of mathematics in precise axiomatic systems and then prove, using only very elementary finitary reasoning about symbols, that these systems are free of contradiction.
Right, exactly right. Let's imagine what it would be like if he had been right. So we would have this finitary theory, and it would prove that the strong theory was free of contradiction. So we could start enumerating proofs from the strong theory. Right now we can write a computer program that would systematically generate all possible proofs from a given theory. And so we could have like this theorem enumeration machine that just spit out theorems all day long in such a manner that every single theorem would eventually be produced by this device. And so if you had a mathematical question of any kind, you could answer it by just waiting for either the answer to come out yes from the machine or the answer to come out no. So the nature of mathematical investigation in Hilbert's world is one of just turning the crank of the theorem enumeration machine, devoid of creative thinking or imagination. It's just getting the answer from this by rote procedure. So Hilbert, in effect, is telling us, with his program, that the fundamental nature of mathematics is rote computation. The way I think about the Hilbert program seems extremely attractive in the historical context of being worried about the antinomies, the inconsistencies. And so how can we kind of block them? And so it seems natural, first of all, to have a strong theory that's going to answer all the questions, because the idea of logical independence and pervasiveness that we now know exists just wasn't, there was no known, they didn't know anything like that happening ever. And so it's natural to think that it wouldn't happen, and also that they would be able to guard against this inconsistency. So it seems like the goals of the Hilbert program are quite natural in that historical context. But, when you think a little more about what the nature of it would be like, it shows you this kind of rote procedure. And now you're saying, well, that doesn't seem so unlikely. Maybe, in the light of the increasing computer power and so on, it's actually maybe turning into our everyday experience where the machines are calculating more and more for us, and in a way that could be alarming. Okay. So to talk about the alternative to the Hilbert point of view, if he's wrong, then what is the nature of mathematical reality? Well, it would mean that we couldn't ever, maybe for the first goal, we couldn't ever write down a theory that answered all the questions. So we would always be in a situation where our best theory, even the infinitary theories, would have questions that they stumble with and are unable to answer. Independence would occur. But then also, because of the failure of the second goal, we would also have to be constantly worrying about whether our theories were consistent or not, and we wouldn't have any truly convincing means of saying that they were free from contradiction. And the fact of Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows that that is exactly the nature of mathematical reality, actually. Those are the two incompleteness theorems. So the first incompleteness theorem says you cannot write down a computably axiomatizable theory that answers all the questions. Every such theory will be incomplete, assuming it includes a certain amount of arithmetic. And secondly, no such theory can ever prove its own consistency. So not only is it the case that the finitary theory can't prove the consistency of the strong infinitary theory, but even the infinitary theory can't prove its own consistency, right? That's the second incompleteness theorem. And so it's, in that sense, a decisive takedown of the Hilbert program, which is really quite remarkable, the extent to which his theorem just really answered that whole puzzle. It's quite amazing. There's another aspect kind of easy to think about. If you're wondering about theories that prove their own consistency, then, I mean, would you trust a theory that proves of itself that it's consistent? I mean, that's like, it's like the used car salesman telling you, "Oh, I'm trustworthy." I mean, it's not a reason to trust the used car salesman, is it? Just because he says that. So similarly, if you have a theory that proves its own consistency, well, I mean, even an inconsistent theory would prove its own consistency. And so it doesn't seem to be a logical reason to believe in the consistency if you have a theory that proves itself consistent.
Just for clarification, you use the word theory. Is it in this context synonymous with axiomatic system?
Right. So in mathematical logic, theory is a technical term, and it means any set of sentences in a formal language. And so if you say axiomatic system, it's basically synonymous to my usage with theory. So a theory means, the consequences of a set of axioms, or people are sometimes unclear on whether they just mean the axioms or the consequences of the axioms.
So theory includes both the axioms and the consequences of the axioms, and you use it interchangeably, and the context is supposed to help you figure out which of the two you're talking about, the axioms or the consequences, or maybe to you, they're basically the same.
Yeah, well, they're so closely connected, although, all the features aren't the same. So if you have a computable list of axioms for a theory, then you can start enumerating the consequences of the axioms. But you won't be able to computably decide whether a given statement is a consequence or not. You can enumerate the consequences, so you can semi-decide the consequences, but you won't be able to decide yes or no whether a given statement is a consequence or not. So it's the distinction between a problem being computably decidable and a problem being computably enumerable, which was made clear following the work of Turing and others that came from that. I mean, so that's one difference between the list of axioms of the theory and the theory itself. The axioms could be, you can decide maybe computably whether something is an axiom or not, but that doesn't mean that you can decide computably whether or not something is a theorem or not. Usually you only get to decide the positive instances. If something is a theorem, you will eventually come to recognize that. But if something isn't a theorem, maybe at no point will you be able to say, no, that's not a theorem.
And that's, of course, connected to the halting problem.
Yeah.
And all of these contradictions and paradoxes are all nicely, beautifully interconnected.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So can we just linger on Gödel's incompleteness
Sure.
theorem? You mentioned the two components there. There's so many questions to ask. Like, what is the difference between provability and truth? What is true and what is provable? Maybe that's a good line to draw.
Yeah, this is a really core distinction that it's fascinating to me to go back and read even the early 20th century people before Gödel and Tarski, and they were totally sloppy about this distinction between truth and proof. It wasn't clear at all until Gödel, basically. Although even as late as Bourbaki has a kind of confusion in these foundational works. So these standard graduate level textbooks used in France in the presentation of logic, they are conflating truth and proof. To be true for them means to be provable. So in the early days, maybe it wasn't clear enough that the concept of truth needed a mathematical investigation or analysis. Maybe it was already taken to be fully clear. But because of the incompleteness theorem, we realized that actually there's quite subtle things happening, right? And so why don't we talk about this distinction a bit? To me, it's absolutely core and fundamental to our understanding of mathematical logic now, this distinction between truth and proof. So truth is on the semantic side of the syntax semantics dichotomy. Truth has to do with the nature of reality. I mean, okay, when I talk about reality, I'm not talking about physical reality. I'm talking about mathematical reality. So we have a concept of something being true in a structure, a statement being true in a mathematical structure. Like maybe you have the real field or something and you want to know, does it satisfy this statement or that statement? Or you have a group of some kind, or maybe you have a graph. This is a particular kind of mathematical structure that has a bunch of vertices and edges, and you want to know, does this graph satisfy that statement? And Tarski gave this absolutely wonderful account of the nature of truth in what's now known as the disquotational theory of truth. And what Tarski says is, the sentence, quote, "Snow is white," unquote, is true if and only if snow is white. And what he means by that is, look, to say truth is a property of an assertion, so we can think of the assertion as a syntactically. So the sentence is true if and only if the content of the sentence is the case. So the sentence "snow is white," in quotations, is true. That just means that snow is white. And that's why it's called the disquotational theory, because we remove the quotation marks from the assertion, right? And you can use this idea of disquotation to give a formal definition of truth in a mathematical structure of a statement in a formal language. So, for example, if I have a formal language that allows me to make atomic statements about the objects and relations of the structure, and I can build up a formal language with the logical connectives of and or and implies and not and so on, and maybe I have quantifiers, right? Then, for example, to say that the structure satisfies phi and psi, that single statement, phi and psi, I'm thinking of that as one statement, just means that it satisfies phi and it satisfies psi. And if you notice what happened there, at first, the "and" was part of the sentence, inside the sentence. But then in the second part, I was using the word "and" to refer to the conjunction of the two conditions. So
hence the disquotation.
Yeah, it has the disquotation. And so this idea can be done for all the logical connectors and quantifiers and everything. You're applying Tarski's idea of disquotation. And it allows you to define by induction the truth of any assertion in a formal language inside any mathematical structure. And so to say that a sentence is true, first of all, it's ambiguous unless you tell me which structure you're talking about it being true in. And so maybe we have in mind the standard model of arithmetic or something with the natural numbers and the arithmetic structure, and I want to know, is a given statement true in that structure? Then we have a formal definition of what that means, according to the Tarski recursive definition of truth. Okay, that's truth. Proof, on the other hand, is, in this Hilbert way of thinking, we can develop proof theory. What is a proof for a mathematician, for a mathematical logician? A proof is a certain sequence or arrangement of sentences in the formal language that accord with the logical rules of a proof system. So there's certain modes of reasoning that are allowed. So if you know A and you know A implies B in the proof, then at a later step, you're allowed to write B as a consequence. So if you know A and you know A implies B, those are both two statements that are known, then you can deduce B as a consequence according to the rule of modus ponens. This is the rule modus ponens. And, there's a lot of other rules. Some people would call this implication elimination. There's different kinds of proof systems. There's a lot of different formal proof systems that exist that are studied by the proof theorists. And all of them have the property that they're sound, which means that if the premises of the argument are all true in a structure, and you have a proof to get a conclusion, then the conclusion is also true in that structure. So that's what it means to be sound, that proofs preserve truth. They're truth-preserving arguments, okay? But also, the proof systems are also generally complete. They're both sound and complete. And complete means that whenever a statement is a consequence, a logical consequence of some other statements, which means that whenever the assumptions are true, then the consequence is also true in the structure. So whenever you have a logical consequence, then there is a proof of it. Okay. And the proof systems generally have both of those properties. They're sound and complete. There's a third property. A lot of logicians talk about sound and complete this, sound and complete that, but actually there's a hidden third adjective that they should always be talking about in any such case, which is that you should be able to recognize whether or not something is a proof or not. So there's a computable aspect to the proof systems. We want to be able to recognize whether something is a proof. It should be computably decidable whether a given sequence of statements is a proof or not. So we don't want a proof system in which someone claims to have a proof, but we can't check that fact, that whether it's a proof or not. We want to be able to correctly adjudicate all claims to having a proof.
Yeah, a mathematician comes to mind that said he has a proof, but the margins are too small to continue.
Right, exactly.
So that doesn't count as a proof.
So generally, all the classical proof systems that are used are sound and complete and also computably decidable in the sense that we can decide whether something is a proof or not.
So what is, again, the tension between truth and proof? Which is more powerful, and how do the two interplay with the contradictions that we've been discussing?
So the incompleteness theorem is the question whether we could, say, write down a theory for arithmetic, say for the standard model of arithmetic where we have the natural numbers and plus and times and 0, 1 and less than and so on. In that formal language, we can express an enormous number of statements about the nature, not only of arithmetic, but actually by various coding methods, we can express essentially all of finite mathematics in that structure. So the question would be, can we write down a computable list of axioms that will answer all those questions by proof? In other words, we want to have a complete theory, a theory of arithmetic that proves all and only the true statements. That would be the goal. Hilbert would love that. I mean, that would be supportive of Hilbert's program, to have such a complete theory of arithmetic. And Gödel proved that this is impossible. You cannot write down a computable list of axioms that is complete in that sense. There will always be statements. If the theory is consistent, there will always be statements that you cannot prove and you cannot refute. So they are independent of that theory.
How traumatic is that there are statements that are independent from the theory?
I mean, my view is that, this isn't traumatic at all. This is rather completely eye-opening in terms of our understanding of the nature of mathematical reality. I mean, we understand this profound fact about our situation with regard to mathematical truth. The incompleteness theorem tells us, look, we just can't write down a list of axioms that is going to be consistent and is going to answer all the questions. It's impossible. And so I don't think of it as trauma. I just think, look, this is the nature of mathematical reality, and it's good that we know it. And so now we need to move on from that and, do what we can in light of that.
Is it fair to say that in general, it means if I give you a statement, you can't know if your axiomatic system would be able to prove it?
That's right. In general, you cannot, the provability problem, we can formulate it as a decision problem. Given a theory and given a statement, is that statement a consequence of that theory? This is one of the most famous decision problems. In fact, the very first one, because it's equivalent to the Hilbert-Ackermann Entscheidungsproblem, which is also appearing in the title of Turing's 1936 paper that was so important for computability theory. So it's a formulation of the Entscheidungsproblem. Does a given theory have a given statement as a logical consequence? Which, because of Gödel's completeness theorem, not his incompleteness theorem, but his earlier completeness theorem, Gödel had proved that the proof systems that they studied did have this completeness property that I mentioned. So provability is the same as logical consequence. And this is an undecidable decision problem. Turing proved, and we now know it's equivalent to the halting problem.
Can you describe the halting problem? Because it's a thing that shows up in a very useful and, again, traumatic way through a lot of computer science, through a lot of mathematics.
Yeah, the halting problem is expressing a fundamental property of computational processes. So given a program, or maybe we think of it as a program together with its input, but let me just call it a program. So given a program, we could run that program, but I want to pose it as a decision problem. Will this program ever complete its task? Will it ever halt? The halting problem is the question. Given a program, will it halt? Yes or no? And of course, for any one instance, the answer is either yes or no. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether there's a computable procedure to answer all instances of this question. So it's a decision problem is given as a scheme of instances for all possible programs that you could ask about. What I want to know is there a computable procedure that will answer those questions, right? And it turns out the answer is no. The halting problem is computably undecidable. There is no computable procedure that will correctly answer all instances of whether a given program will halt. And of course, we can get half the answers in the sense that you give me a program and you say, will this halt? And I could take that program and I could run it.
Mm-hmm.
And I could keep running it. And maybe in a week it would halt. And at that time I could say, yes, it halted. So I can get the yes answers correctly for halting, all the yes answers. But the problem is, if it didn't halt yet, like maybe I waited, 1,000 years and it still hasn't halted, I don't seem entitled to say, no, it's not going to halt yet, because maybe in 1,001 years it'll halt. And so at no point can I seem to say no. In order to say no, it won't ever halt, it seems like I would have to really understand how the program worked and what it was doing. So giving the yes answers was sort of trivial. You didn't have to understand it. You just needed to run it, which is a kind of rote task. But to give the no answers, you need to have a kind of deep insight into the nature of the program and what it's doing in such a way that you would understand it and be able to see, oh no, I can see this program is never going to halt because, it's a much more difficult task to say, no, it won't halt than it is to say, yes, it halted because I ran it and it halted. And it turns out to be impossible to have a computable procedure that gives the no answers. Yeah. And the argument is not very difficult. Should we do it?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. Suppose toward contradiction, all these proofs are by contradiction. And this argument is going to be a diagonal argument in the same style as the Russell argument and the Cantor argument and Gödel's argument that we haven't talked about yet. So many diagonal arguments come in. So suppose towards contradiction that we had a procedure for determining whether a given program halted on a given input. Now let me describe. I'm going to use that procedure as a subroutine in the following process. And my process, let's call it Q, process Q. And it takes as input a program P. Okay? And the first thing it does is it asks that subroutine, hey, would P halt if I ran it on P itself? Okay? That's the diagonal part because we're applying P to P, right? Okay, so I'm describing program Q. And program Q takes as input P, which is itself a program. And the first thing it does is it asks the halting subroutine program, would P halt on P? And if the answer comes back from the subroutine, yeah, that would halt, then what I do in program Q is I immediately jump into an infinite loop. So I don't halt. If P halts on P, I don't halt. But if the answer came back, no, P is never going to halt on P, then I halt immediately. Okay, so and that's it. I've described what Q does. And the thing about Q is that Q's behavior on P was the opposite of P's behavior on P. That's how we designed Q specifically so that Q on P had the opposite behavior as P on P. Okay, so now, of course, what do we do? Well, the same thing that Russell did and so forth and Cantor, we ask, well, what would Q do on Q? And because of this opposite behavior, Q would halt on Q if and only if Q does not halt on Q, which is a contradiction, because Q has to have the opposite behavior on Q than Q does, but that's just contradictory.
What a beautiful proof.
It's simple. Absolutely beautiful. Yeah, I agree. And it's following the same logic of Russell and Cantor. Going back to Cantor, basically, because Russell is also quoting Cantor in his letter to Frege. So therefore, the conclusion is that the halting problem is not computably decidable. And now we can immediately prove Gödel's theorem using this. Actually, it's an immediate consequence. So why don't we just do that? I view this as the simplest proof of Gödel's theorem. You don't need the Gödel sentence to prove Gödel's theorem. You can do it with the halting problem. So suppose that we could write down a computable axiomatization of all of the true facts of elementary mathematics, meaning arithmetic and finite combinatorial things such as Turing machine computations and so on. So in fact, all those finite combinatorial processes are formalizable inside arithmetic with the standard arithmetization coding process. But let me just be a little bit informal and say, suppose we could write down a complete theory of elementary finite mathematics. So we have an axiomatization of that theory. Then we could produce all possible theorems from those axioms in the way that I was describing earlier with Hilbert's program. I mean, if we had a complete theory of elementary mathematics, we could construct a theorem enumeration machine that produced all the theorems and only the theorems from that theory. So now I have this theorem enumeration device on my desk, and I announce that I'm open for business to solve the halting problem. So you give me a program and input that you want to run that program on, and I'm going to answer the halting problem. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to wait for the statement coming out of the theorem enumeration device that asserts either that P does halt on that input, or I wait for the statement that P does not halt on that input. But one of them is going to happen because it was a complete theory that was enumerating all the true statements of elementary mathematics. So therefore, if I had such a system, I could solve the halting problem. But we already proved that you cannot solve the halting problem. So therefore, you cannot have such a complete theory of arithmetic. So that proves Gödel's theorem.